Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
It's been 400 years since the first slaves arrived in Virginia, and the little-noticed event, at least at the time, paved the way for an institution whose effects are still being felt to this day. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. May have been a quiet day in 1619 when the Portuguese vessel docked at Jamestown with its human cargo. These some 20 slaves had come from Angola in West Africa. But on that day, the racialized institution of slavery in what would become the United States was born. It was not only created an economic system, but also a set of social institutions that lived on long after slavery was ended by the Civil War. From it, the oppression of Jim Crow would flow into the 20th century. And even with the end of segregation in the Civil Rights era, the damage was clearly done, while racial discrimination would take on other forms. Salisbury University is marking the anniversary of the arrival of Jamestown with the 1619 to 2019 400 Years of Resilience. In our studio this morning from the Salisbury University is Dr. April Logan, Associate Professor of English, and Joseph Venosa, Associate Professor of History, and welcome to the program.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So let's just start with that, as I indicate. It was probably a quiet day when these slaves arrived. Hardly anybody really knew what was about to happen. Joseph, I'm going to turn to you. Tell me about the significance of this and how slavery becomes, in essence, racialized.
Sure. It's a great question, and it's the basis of so much, scholarship and still current discussion. But essentially, you're right. When the initial Dutch ship that arrives in Jamestown that carries, 20 West Africans who are actually from the Caribbean initially comes, they weren't necessarily thinking in racialized terms because you had a society in Jamestown that was not yet defining slavery exclusively by racial terms, by phenotype. That is going to happen in the decades following. But certainly by the 1660s and 1670s, there is a clear understanding in the colonies that equates blackness with servitude and eventually with lifetime enslavement. And so 1619, although it as you said, is as a particular, as a day, it's not particularly noticeable. But as time goes on, that is sort of an important date that historians look back on to sort of see that this really is the beginning of a process where we do see enslavement and racism intertwined in mainland North America in a very profound way.
Well, now we have, for instance, Bacon's Rebellion, which is 1676, which seemed to really make that transition. Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, Bacon's Rebellion was rooted in a number of things, but the upshot of it was that after that period, particularly in response to concerns that white indentured servants as well as blacks and other oppressed groups could sort of theoretically mobilize together for their own interests, there is sort of a hyper transition to increasingly trying to divide settlers based on status through race, so that you have sort of indentured servants that were white and lower class whites that are sort of given sort of at least this sense that they're better off at least than black slaves. And so the racialization of slavery really, although it was going that way, it certainly after Bacon's Rebellion really takes off in the following decades. And so that's also another key point that we look at to say, okay, this is a moment where that created a response in which race was again used to really sort of help inculcate people to thinking that they might be lower class, they might be dispossessed, but at least they're not black, right? And then again, blackness being used as a marker for not only enslavement, but for certain kinds of status.
Also, give us a sense about the economics of this, because we associate slavery particularly with the cotton industry, but the cotton industry doesn't come until actually later. Give us a sense about that transition.
Sure. Well, in this region, both on the eastern shore here of Maryland and Virginia and down by Williamsburg itself, you have a slave society that develops out of the need to produce tobacco. And what you have is a sort of an interesting mix where you do have that cash crop growing, And of course, it is going to develop into a major source of slave labor. But you also have, at the same time, an interesting dynamic where you do have a fairly large free black population. So on the eastern shore of Virginia in the 1660s, you have 20% of people of African descent who are free. And yet at the same time, that tobacco economy, as time goes on, is again pushing for enslavement because it's profitable to use slave labor to produce it in such quantities. It's not the same, obviously, as cotton will be later, and it's certainly not the same as sugar, which is even going to be more of a money-making cash crop all across the Americas. But in this region, tobacco really is sort of the key cash crop that opens the doorway to mass enslavement.
So, touching on sort of expanding into the South, talk a little bit about the importance of the fact that cotton becomes a profitable crop, particularly with the cotton gin. I mean, almost as if this device allows this expansion.
Yeah, well, that's an important point because by the late 1700s, cotton production was not seen in a lot of parts of the United States as a long-term cash crop that would be sustained in the way that we think of it now. But with Eli Whitney's development of the cotton gin, the ability to exploit that crop grows, and ironically, it sort of reinvigorates the slave trade within the United States and is actually going to increase demand for it, particularly again in the very deep South, in states like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, what we now call the Black Belt. So it's an interesting process by which, as the economy changes, slavery is going to change with it. And if slavery can be utilized to make a certain cash crop more valuable, it's going to be used. And so in the U.S., we, as you said, we associate it with cotton, although initially we have, in this region, tobacco, and in the Carolina Low Country, we have rice. That was another big cash crop that was being produced. So there's a lot of diversity to it, but yeah, cotton in the public memory of the America, in the United States and in enslavement, we tend to associate that.
Now, the other thing I was reading is the fact that obviously there was a great deal of discussion, particularly at the time of the drawing of the Constitution, about slavery. There were some people who wanted it obviously banned. Obviously, it was really inculcated into the Constitution. But what's really interesting is that they want to end the slave trade itself, but it looks as if by the time they do, it's no longer needed because they are producing huge numbers of slaves indigenously. You have situations where, in Mississippi, for instance, there were no slaves at all at 1800. By 1860, you had something like 2 million. I mean, it seemed as if they were relying upon this. That African Americans was this engine that the breeding engine that they were using.
Yeah. Do you want to speak to that as well?
Go ahead.
I would just say that they think that's absolutely the case. So sometimes people want to think that signal an ideological change, but I think what Joe's comments have been highlighting for us is that it wasn't necessarily these changes related to slavery in the United States weren't necessarily about values or beliefs evolving, but had to do with economics. And yes, it's one of the most horrifying and ugly aspects of slavery is that slave masters were sleeping with slave women. They were profiting from, having relations with enslaved women. And so that was a way to, even though you've abolished slavery, you can still take advantage of that slave capital, that slave labor, and exploit that. So people basically born into slavery, living in slavery, what have you.
And again, there is a very interesting sort of paradox where you have people, again, many of whom are slave owners who at the same time, they're pushing for, as you said, the eradication of the actual transatlantic slave trade, right? And eventually is outlawed in 1808. But again, as you indicated, there's an internal slave trade that continues right through the mid 1860s. The Upper South, Virginia, North Carolina, is essentially the basis for a massive migration of people that goes into the Deep South and then eventually out west into what becomes Texas and the Western Territories. And people also viewed that as a kind of safety valve because one of the concerns that people, including Thomas Jefferson and many of sort of the Virginia landed elites sort of talked about was this fear that if you have areas that are just overwhelmingly black, you're going to have eventually slave rebellions and race wars. And the big fear, the nightmare scenario for these people was Haiti. That's what they did not want.
Right, the rebellion.
Right. So thinking of the internal slave trade is also a way of thinking about this idea of, it's kind of a safety valve for the pressure of slavery. You can essentially move people not only to more profitable areas, but you can disperse populations in such a way that you don't have blacks as an overwhelming majority in certain places where rebellion is going to be more likely.
I understand, by the way, it was almost an important issue in Virginia when it came to the Second Amendment and writing up the right to own weapons, i.e. for militia. Mm-hmm. Militia is not just simply against the federal government, but also to control the slaves.
Absolutely. We have to understand the very first real major laws about firearms in the continental U.S. occur after slave rebellions. So if you look at like South Carolina, there's a major slave rebellion in 1739. It's called the Stono Rebellion. It's immediately followed the next year by the Negro Act of 1740. And one of the things that it requires is for militia service. It requires white males to be armed. And it creates this dynamic where militia service is very much tied to the need to control populations that could rebel. And so there is a fundamental connection between, how people are being put into the service of, public order and controlling certain groups of people based on race.
And that, I just wanted to say that I think that also relates to the colonization plan, if you want to talk about that, the 19th century, which, there was some controversy around that, which was the idea if you had free blacks, then you would, the idea was to send them back to Africa more or less. And even some African Americans supported, obviously for very different reasons, because they really felt that it was basically impossible to get a fair shake in the United States. But then some, the impression was that a lot of, white politicians were supporting it simply because they were, afraid of this risk of rebellion, enslaved and free blacks sort of working together to sort of assert and demand their rights. And so this just goes back to a lot of sort of efforts to sort of control that threat of rebellion or revolt that sort of was sparked somewhat by Haiti.
Indeed, as a matter of fact, Frederick Douglass railed against the idea of going back. That we're American, we're no longer that.
Yeah, yeah. And again, it's ironic that a lot of people who themselves were slave owners, major American politicians like Henry Clay, who were also part of the founding of the American Colonization Society. So you have this. It's a very weird group of people. You have some people who are looking to colonization as an example of African American empowerment. Others who are just trying to encourage people to go so that there can be this avoidance of a possible race war. Missionaries. I mean, it's a very odd mixture, and with a lot of Maryland roots, because a lot of African Americans who do go and settle in Western Africa, particularly in Liberia, have roots on the Eastern Shore or even in the Western counties. So there, it is an interesting local connection that we have to that whole idea of colonization.
I want to turn to you and give us a sense of what you read was life like for if there is such a thing, for the average slave.
I think in some ways I do want to, I guess with my class, I somewhat resist the idea of the quote-unquote average slave. I think there was a lot of complexity to the experiences of enslaved African Americans. I think it sort of ran the gamut to, sort of the most horrifying, terrible experiences you can imagine that we see in works by Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, sort of just shooting people for, crying over their children, whipping, rape, and all that. But I also like to say that there was a lot of community there, and I think that comes across in the works. Efforts to escape. That was a part of it, resistance, but as part of the daily life, I also like to sort of talk about sincere efforts to retain their cultural beliefs and values through their practices, through linguistic practices, song, all these sorts of ways to sort of retain a semblance of, a sense of themselves as, coming to America. That's a part of it, but also sort of trying to retain some of those African experiences and a sense of themselves as a people in the United States. So, like I said, I think you had, people often say, okay, well, the women were in the house and the men were in the fields. That wasn't true. Men and women worked in the fields and in the house. You had some people who had a lot of mobility. Even though they were enslaved, they were allowed to travel back and forth and work and maybe keep some money for themselves and give some to the master. It really sort of varied as far as what we might say is the average life for enslaved Africans. But I think at the end of the day, I think when you read the works, you really see that there was a complexity of an experience as far as, even some Africans owned slaves themselves, maybe for different reasons. Maybe they were purchasing family members. Maybe they thought they could make things better for others. Maybe they were just good Americans trying to make some money and have property. So I think that's the benefit of sort of reading the literature, is that you can see it really ran the gamut of experiences. Certainly, what sort of, I think, I don't know if Joe would agree, what distinguishes American slavery is that close relationship to race. And it was an industry, as we were just talking about, people breeding slaves, people profiting. And so I think that's another reason people look at American slavery in a particular sort of way. But with all that going on, still sincere efforts to sort of have their own traditions evolve, find ways to resist and celebrate and still live life.
One of the things that strikes me is the difficulty for slaves to keep family together, or because those are very, very strong connections, and yet you see them divided up very easily. Describe that effort to try to keep the families together, and yet knowing that at any time a husband or wife or even children could be simply sold off.
I think that's why, in some ways there's this sense of, even when we talk about the 19th century, if you want to have a discussion about the idea of sort of black nationalism, a nation within a nation, I think you can go even smaller to this idea of a black community and family, such that one of the reasons why you have very close bonds with people who aren't necessarily blood relations is because of that reality where your blood relations are sold off. And I think people just had to deal with the situations where they were in, but there are many stories of people traveling miles on foot to visit family members. After the the end of the Civil War and emancipation, for me it's just very moving to see all the notices that came out with people trying to find their loved ones, their sons, their daughters, their wives and partners. And so I think that was just a horrible, terrible aspect of slavery that people just had to try to negotiate. And I think that has to do with a variety of different bonds that weren't necessarily related to relations. But again, going back to the cultural survivals, people came here and sort of created their own language, African American vernacular English. All those things sort of cut across some of the traditional types of differences we think about people in terms of, family names, even regional difference. When you're sort of pushed into a situation when everyone is oppressed, then it sort of creates a special, different types of bonds, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. Just to jump on that briefly, this is, I think, the fundamental thing that is at the core of it is that you have a system, both in this country and elsewhere in the Americas, where people that are enslaved are legally chattel. They're property, right? They're no different, legally speaking, than any other object, right? They are things. But yet, humans being humans, they still find ways to have agency and meaning despite those legal parameters that they're boxed into. So, family dynamics, naming practices, religious traditions, food ways. These are things that survive in spite of slavery, and they demonstrate, again, this amazing paradox where despite all that legality, all of those institutional ways to control people and literally rob people of their own flesh and blood, people find a way to be resilient and to still keep, or try to keep, their humanity even in these incredibly oppressive situations.
And also, just to make it explicit, because I know some people are watching, going back to the family, people weren't just sold. We know that in the system, basically, if your mother was a slave, then you were automatically enslaved. And so I think that's the beginning of the, disintegration of the, at least in the traditional, as we think about it, the sort of attack on, I won't say the disintegration, because people still continued with those beliefs and values, but really sort of an attack on the idea of family, a sense of identity, heritage, all of that, sort of built into the system to say that, if you're born a slave, even if one of your family members was free, if your mom was a slave, you were a slave.
Speak to this fact that one of the things that seems to unify the African American family or African Americans is religion. Something that they did not have when they first came from Africa, i.e. Christianity, which seemed to fit very well into where they were in terms of an enslaved people. How important was that institution, and can you give us some sense about how it grew?
I mean, I think the idea of Christianity, and again, I think we want to think about it in a complex way, is that I like to sort of think about the idea that even though many of them came to Christianity, I mean, I think part of the allure, especially with the first Great Awakening, then the second Great Awakening, was the idea of, sort of Christianity for all. So from the beginning, it was sort of appealing in the 18th century because it was sort of an equalizer in a sense. Even if, in the everyday world, there was social stratification, slavery. The idea was that in another world, or at least in this other system, this other institution of religion, people were somewhat supposed to be seen as equals. And I think it was also appealing because as racial difference gets codified, so does cultural difference, and so it became an opportunity to sort of find common ground through Christian beliefs, and you definitely see that in a lot of the abolitionist rhetoric, anti-slavery regulators sort of drawing on the idea, what are our values as, a Christian nation, a Christian people. So I think that's one of the reasons why it became important as a way to sort of hold the nation accountable to certain beliefs and values it was supposed to have. But as far as going back to, was it an interesting blending? A lot of, not to take it away from the distinction of different African nations, but, there's a little bit of a different worldview. There's not the same sort of distance between the secular and the spiritual. And I think that sort of comes out when you look at the faith practices of, Baptist churches, other churches. And so even though it's still Christianity, maybe the form is a little bit different because it is a little bit of a blending with these sort of sensibilities that they did bring with them, perhaps from other forms of religion, and then sort of applied here, that idea of the vernacular to suit their situation. Then, of course, as we go into the civil rights movement, the church sort of takes on this sort of political role, communal role, but that's partially because of segregation. I mean, if you don't have access to certain services, church, businesses, where does everybody meet? It's the church. So it's really a natural transition from, the church as sort of mobilizing to provide services, take care of families, connect people, to then using that as an opportunity to sort of organize around bettering rights, these sorts of initiatives and that sort of thing. So it's not, you see a lot of the significant leaders coming from a religious background, Martin Luther King, but even though Malcolm X wasn't Christianity, I say his dad was a minister, and so he sort of just takes some of that into into Islam. So I think as far as Christianity, I think it sort of just helped them preserve again, values and beliefs, but, a sense of righteousness, a sense of justice. And so I think that, it becomes a way to sort of mobilize politically, but also, again, to sort of maintain the, that sense of humanity, that sense of community and agency. So I think, in my mind, that's the role that religion, played in terms of this history of enslavement in the United States.
Now, even with the end of slavery, one of the observations I've always made is that slavery had, by this time, created two socially identified groups, whites and blacks, and their relationship. So that even when slavery ends, that relationship doesn't end. It just simply transforms itself. Joe, talk a little bit about that, the fact that you begin to have you do have a small moment of time of Reconstruction where it looks like everything is possible, but then the walls seem to close in with all of these laws.
Yeah, well, that's a very important point. Also, just as important is the fact that, when slavery officially ends in 1865, it doesn't really end fully because there is, of course, this major stipulation in the 13th Amendment that states that people that are incarcerated can still essentially be enslaved. In fact, there's a film that'll be shown this semester on campus called 13th, which looks at this, because what often happens is, the end of slavery, at least officially, simply transitions to mass incarceration, even during Reconstruction. So you have people who are literally, incarcerated for petty crimes, or in some cases for fabricated crimes, and they are literally working in the same fields that they were months earlier as slaves. And in some cases, people weren't even told that slavery was ended. You have stories of, particularly in very rural areas, people were not told. And there are counties in Mississippi where people were literally taken back into slavery and were essentially ransomed. until people pay. I mean, this is an aspect of it that's often overlooked. So you have just that issue of there's not really a clear break, but even when you do get into the sort of formalized Jim Crow era, you're right. You have this amazing period in part of Reconstruction where in certain states where African Americans are a majority, they're able to actually get political power. You have former slaves in states like Mississippi and South Carolina that become senators and that become congressmen. There are actually more black senators in 1870 than there were in certainly 1970, but even in 2010. But it's an example of a brief window, and then you're right, it goes into this era where, once again, by sort of using loopholes in the law, by not enforcing the law, and by simply using mass violence and terrorism, people are effectively stripped of their legal equality. We often forget that political violence in America in the 1860s and 1870s was on levels that were, that today would elicit shock. I mean, there were, in the presidential election of 1868, in the congressional elections of 1870 and 1872, thousands of people were killed in states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida. I mean, literally. And so, that certainly is going to go a long way into creating a Jim Crow system, because even if blacks are a majority in certain areas, if whites can have legal power still, access to firearms, and more importantly, indifference from the federal government, it creates a system where, you're right, everything on paper might say equality, but in reality, those rights are very tenuous.
And so I think basically, what you're sort of talking about in a term that is useful is the idea of neo-slavery. I mean, that was really what you saw during Reconstruction. After it, debt peonage, sharecropping, basically very similar practices where you say, hey, you can, I'll loan you a certain amount of money so that you can work this property, or so that you can, buy some kind of equipment, but it costs so much and they're going to pay so little that in essence you're indebted to the owners of that property or whatever it is that you borrowed for the rest of your life. And then what Joe's also referring to is the convict lease system, where basically, yes, you could get arrested for, standing on a corner with a group of friends, and then you're, basically then you're lent out to, a company to do work or whatever it is, with,
chain gangs.
Chain gangs, this sort of thing. And then people actually even died and were, never got out of that wrongfully. So, and then, as we're talking about neo-slavery going into the 1890s, Joe's sort of highlighting the violence. That's where you sort of see, what a lot of historians call the nadir period, which is to say the lowest point of race relations, and because it's the idea that even though there's laws in place, it's almost as if no one really cares because of the extreme violence that is sort of a pushback to the gains of Reconstruction to sort of suppress those rights. And I'm not quite sure who said it, but basically they were sort of saying that in some ways the African body sort of almost seemed to have less value, because if you were a slave and they killed you, they felt like they were losing some money. But now that you were free, what difference does it make? And so that's why it's really sort of terrifying in its own right. We can think about lynching, that sort of thing, as you go into the late 1890s and into the 20th century.
So obviously the civil rights movement comes along and it wipes out a lot of the laws that legally separated people. But as I suggested in the opening, new forms of restrictions seem to be put into place. Again, that relationship between whites and blacks in the United States. And now here we are in 2019, and in 2008 we elected the first African American to become president of the United States. Where do you think we are in relationship to that history, April?
Well, I mean, I think this is the benefit of bringing a historian, a literary professor. There's the tendency to think of history as linear, as making progress, but I think it's really cyclical. So as far as to say where we are in American history, I think we have to have a series like the one that we're having at SU to look at the 400 years. A lot of people really don't even know what slavery was. I mean, I did a lot of due justice to the complexity and the humanity, but people also have no idea about the deprivation, the violence, the raping, the terror, all of these things, and then how then it moves into political system economic system, education, like, basically what in my mind, the civil rights movement put on the books a lot of laws, but that doesn't mean there wasn't still what's needed is a lot of ideological and cultural work. But we can't, I almost feel like we can't really do that work justice until we really look at that history, which is also not really being attended to as far as where we are right now. I think we're at a point where, we have to sort of make sure that we maintain the ground that was gained in terms of laws. But I think this is a unique opportunity to try to push us further as a nation as far as the culture, the ideology, because I think people have somewhat forgotten, how we came to be where we are today, and that's partially because maybe we haven't attended to the history, and there was this false sense that, oh, now we've gone beyond it, we've got these laws, everything has changed. Although, as you said, there's still those power relations, those power dynamics, operating, and also it's more subtle, right? Partially because you have the laws in some ways that sort of almost makes things a little bit invisible or erases the inequities that still exist and that linger, partially because racism is so entrenched in almost every aspect of American society.
Joseph, what about this idea that there was, I think the term was used, there was a white backlash, particularly after the civil rights movement? We seem to see something that even after President Obama was elected. Again, racial overtones to some of the opposition. What about that?
Yeah. You have to, I think, call it for what it is. Well, again, let's put this in sort of context. Just to go back to the history issue, I can remember a couple weeks ago showing my students little copies of they were high school history textbooks from the states of Texas, Alabama, and I think Florida. And they were just little excerpts on the history of slavery. And a lot of them, and the one in Alabama, I'll never forget, it said, slavery was the first form of Social Security. It's right in an American history textbook. And that was for high schoolers in, I think, 1971 in the state textbook in Alabama. So let's imagine that you've got a nation of people, some of whom come out of that system, because the people in the 50s and 60s that had those textbooks, that's the education system that they're used to. So when you have in the election of 2008, you have some people who essentially says, right, they'll say, okay, well, we elected, quote unquote, a black president. Again, he's half white, but that shows you kind of the nature of race in America. Again, the one drop rule. But people say, well, okay, so that proves that racism is not a thing, right? Now you can look at that logically. That's like saying because I had dinner last night, world hunger is not a problem, right? It's a very false, very simple-minded view, but nevertheless, it did provide people with a sort of out to say, okay, there, see, it's over. There's no issue. But as you said, then there's the backlash of people who say, well, actually, he's from Kenya, or he's a Muslim. Which again, the relevance of that is actually it's lost on me. But people are still using it to kind of denote this idea of he's not, quote, one of us, right? Like I always liken it to, let's say that Barack Obama was actually Barry O'Williams. And there was some discussion that he was born in Ireland, but let's say he was a white Irishman. Would people have been as focused on a birth certificate if that were the case? I think there's a lot to that people don't want to look at because the counter is very subtle, right? It's saying, well, people say, well, it's not racism, but I have these concerns about such and such. And
Well, and I think it also speaks to, the legacy of race in America. I mean, I like to talk about with my students is that, we had we had white abolitionists and we had black abolitionists, but when I say abolitionists to you, it doesn't mean that all those people were invested in seeing blacks as equal, giving blacks rights. I said many of them, almost lost their careers, Lydia Marie Child, the list goes on and on. But there is nuance to the question of race. And so I think, when we think about the rise of Barack Obama, let's look at the context. Who else was running for office? What were the choices? And then what was he able to accomplish while in office? What sorts of negotiations did he have to endure? He couldn't totally present the health plan on his own. He had to get Bill Clinton to translate it for him to the nation. So again, when we think about the work that has to be done, part of it is sort of unpacking this stratification of this is what racism looks like.
Right.
There's a lot of issues in that as far as whether something's racial prejudice, discrimination, unpacking all of these sorts of terms. So I think you're right. The rise of Obama, some people can say, oh, check, we did that. But again, that goes back to we've got to look at the complexities, the nuance. And what happened while he was in office? Coincidence that's the rise of violence to African Americans in the streets from police force? I think not. So, I think, this is what we're saying about the cyclical.
Yeah, sorry.
And we got to end it there.
Yeah,
That's
sorry.
the last word, as it were. Wish we had more time. We've been speaking with April Logan, Dr. April Logan, Associate Professor of English. Also, Joseph Venosa, who is an Associate Professor of History. Appreciate you both stopping by and chatting with us this morning.
Thanks, Don.
Thank
Appreciate it.
you.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.